In the name of fighting drug trafficking and the opioid epidemic, President Trump has placed a reward on the head of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. Venezuela has a history of directly supporting or turning a blind eye to the actions of narco-terrorists such as the FARC, which is the administration's justification for building up its military presence near the country. But this didn't begin with Nicolas Maduro, but with his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And that's the story I want to cover in this video. My name is Grant and you're watching Casual Historian. Let's get started. Venezuela was part of the Spanish Empire between the 16th and 19th centuries, getting independence from Spain in 1823. Like many of the colonies of New Spain, Venezuela's governing institutions were decimated by their War of Independence, leaving the new countries to rebuild them from scratch. And like most former Spanish colonies, Venezuela would lag behind the United States when it came to economic development, due in part to the sporadic civil wars and rebellions. It would be the discovery of oil in the early 20th century that allowed Venezuela to begin building a modern state. The development of the oil industry in the first half of the century would see both foreign workers from across Central Europe and the Mediterranean move to Venezuela, as well as emigration of rural peasants to the cities to service them. But while the wealthier immigrant population moved into the cities themselves, purchasing or building modern homes, the peasants were left to build the shantytown slums that have become ubiquitous stereotypes for much of Latin America. But an equally big, if not larger, issue in Venezuela was race. Venezuela is a multiracial society, with people of mixed European, Indian, and African ancestries. Those of more European descent are typically wealthier than those with more Indian or African ancestry. For most of Venezuela's history, the political and economic elites were those of more European backgrounds, and when immigrants came in to fill those roles in Venezuela's oil industry, they mostly slotted themselves into the European camp. President Romulo Betancourt would seek to ameliorate the race problem through a publicly funded education system and welfare state, hoping to buy off the poorer, typically Afro-Indian peasants. This policy worked for several decades, as standards of living improved for all Venezuelans through the 1970s, especially after the 1973 oil crisis. It was successful in undermining peasant rebellions such as those Fidel Castro sponsored in the 1960s, who provided training in arms. But the booms didn't last, with a global crash in oil prices forcing the Venezuelan government to take austerity measures, including drastic cuts to its welfare system that had kept the race issue at bay. The welfare cuts exacerbated the poverty of the slums, eventually resulting in a riot in Caracas in February of 1989, dubbed the Caracazo, which was put down by the army, killing hundreds of Afro-Indian peasants. This slaughter would inspire one lieutenant colonel, Hugo Chavez, into political action. Hugo Chavez was himself of Afro-Indian heritage, and was raised in poverty by his parents and grandparents, living off the post-war welfare state of Betancourt. He was also involved in student protests in the 60s, and although he initially dreamed of playing professional baseball, he would fall in love with army life after joining the military academy in 1971, after which he would enlist in the army. During his time in the army, he would meet cadets from Panama who raved about the revolution under General Trujillo, as well as getting to meet General Juan Velasco Alvarado of Peru before he was ousted in a coup. After the welfare cuts began, Chavez would begin setting up a secret revolutionary cell within the army, consisting of like-minded soldiers. The Caracazo would inspire Chavez and his cell to mount an insurrection in 1992, which ultimately failed, leading Chavez to be sent to prison. But due to public sympathy for his cause, Chavez would be pardoned after only 2 years, and was released from prison in 1994. Chavez would change his tactics, aiming to gain power electorally with help from his childhood friend and founder of the Socialist Party, Movimiento al Socialismo, Rafael Simón, educating him on grassroots politics. After his release, Chavez would also visit Cuba at the invitation of Fidel Castro, which became the beginning of a long friendship between the Chavista regime and Cuba. The continuance of low oil prices also dragged down the rest of the economy, giving Chavez room to campaign against the traditional center, left, and right parties, which had a history of trading the presidency back and forth. He waged a populist campaign, exploiting the anger of poor, non-white Venezuelans, claiming that the country was actually fabulously wealthy, but an evil cabal of corrupt politicians, businessmen, and mysterious others were secretly hoarding the wealth for themselves. Rafael Caldera, then the 84-year-old president, symbolized an exhausted system. Healthcare was faltering, government jobs ceased to be engines of opportunity as real incomes dropped, and a crack epidemic overtook the poorly policed city as gangs fought over valuable markets, and the murder rate skyrocketed. On election night, December 3, 1998, Chavez would defeat both major parties, winning 56% of the vote. becoming president-elect of Venezuela. He nearly monopolized the Afro-Indian vote, while also winning support from middle-class white voters who believed he could restore order and prosperity after the other parties had failed to do so for the past 20 years. Before his inauguration, Chavez would take another visit to Cuba, which made many Venezuelan leftists fearful, wanting to avoid the mistakes Castro had made in the prior 40 years. Despite Chavez winning the presidency, the older party still controlled a majority of the legislature. To undermine their power, Chavez would advocate for a new constitution during his inaugural address, wanting to replace what he was referring to as the corrupt Fourth Republic that had been in place since 1959, proclaiming himself the founder of a new Fifth Republic. The new constitution was drafted by a constituent assembly elected in July of 1999, and would place the constitution up for a popular referendum that December. The new constitution drastically expanded the power of the presidency, as well as extending presidential terms from 5 to 6 years. It also enshrined a whole slew of new entitlement and affirmative action programs to increase the political power of non-whites and indigenous groups. The referendum passed with 70% of the electorate voting for it, though the political legitimacy of it would be called into question because of the severely reduced turnout due to heavy rains and mudslides that kept people from the polls. Despite this, the Constitution would go into effect, with new elections held in 2000, which saw Chavez re-elected to a new 6-year term. President Chavez would give the Venezuelan left whiplash in the early years of his administration. Before his swearing in, they feared he would lead them down the disastrous Cuban route, but once in office, Chavez learned the truth about the government's finances. It was as broke as they had claimed. He had campaigned on punishing the oligarchs and redistributing the hoarded wealth of the state. In order to keep the government afloat, Chavez needed to balance the budget and keep up payments to various international institutions. He would reduce the number of government ministries down from 21 to 14, with plans to reduce it further down to 9. Leading the Venezuelan left to accuse Chavez of being a neoliberal. Despite the surface-level fiscal reforms, he would shortly after begin expanding the state bureaucracy further, with more ministries and programs. He would use his expansive new powers to establish a cult of personality around his presidency, labeling all of his opponents as traitors to the nation and the revolution. His rhetoric intentionally incited divisions between white and non-white Venezuelans, basing his patronage on social identity and loyalty more so than on ideology, which ended up pushing the middle class out of his coalition. He had the history of Venezuela rewritten to line up with his conception of the 4 republics that preceded the new constitution, with each previous republic associated with a particular group of his political enemies. He used his state control over broadcasting to regularly interrupt TV programs on privately owned stations with speeches, ceremonies, and his own TV show, Allo Presidente, which showed him giving long, rambling monologues about whatever topic he cared about, which would often be punctuated with politically important decisions such as government ministers being fired and eventually property being confiscated. People would call in, but it became like the lottery, everyone looking to get a job, a house, something. That's no way to run a country. The team runs on adrenaline and anxiety. The president can ask for anything at any moment. But before we continue, I would like to take a moment to thank the channel members and patrons for helping keeping Casual Historian going. These supporters help keep the channel going when the algorithm or the sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. And quite frankly, I would prefer to be a little more dependent on direct support of viewers than on AdSense. Supporters get a number of perks, such as access to an exclusive Discord server, as well as getting your name and the scrolling chyron at the end of videos, as well as early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos. And depending on which level or tier you join at, you also get access to the scripts I use to make the videos, as well as the notes that I use to make those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know that most people who choose to support me or any other creator is because they think what we do has value. They like the videos we make and they want to see us make more and better. And with your support, we can. And so if you believe that you do get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then I would suggest becoming a channel supporter. You could click the join button below this video, or you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian and choose a membership tier that's right for you. The current difference between channel memberships and Patreon is that at the moment, Patreon has more options in case you want to give additional support. And Patreon also offers annual subscriptions, whereas channel memberships at the moment only offer month to month. So thanks to all the patrons and channel members, past, present, and future, for supporting this channel and making these videos possible. But for now, let's get back to the history. In addition to the cult of personality, he would fortify himself in the presidential palace of Miraflores, where Chavez chose to live instead of at the private family residence at Casona. More importantly than that, Miraflores Palace was surrounded by slums, filled with Chavez supporters. He would enact other populist policies such as changing the national coat of arms so that the horse was facing leftward instead of right, as well as renaming Columbus Day to the Day of Indigenous Resistance. And while he was actively alienating half of Venezuelan society, he was also actively alienating the international community. As mentioned earlier, during the constitutional referendum, heavy rains caused a massive mudslide, which wiped out thousands of homes on the Avila, with a death toll between 10 and 30,000. Chavez accepted the initial aid sent by the US in the immediate aftermath, but after speaking with Fidel Castro, he rejected President Clinton's offer to send additional aid with the Marines to help rebuild. Despite increasingly hostile behavior, the U.S. ambassador to Caracas tells the White House to not take Chavez's rhetoric at face value. The relationship would get worse after George W. Bush was elected, bringing in many former Reagan advisors who warned him not to interact with Chavez. Chavez would initially condemn the September 11th terror attacks, but he would also condemn the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. He'd also invite the ire of Peru, when he was accused of harboring Vladimiro Montesinos, who was wanted for human rights abuses for his role in the regime of Alberto Fujimori. Chavez would have Montesinos arrested and deported to Peru, but he would suspend diplomatic relations when the Peruvian government claimed that most of the credit belongs with Peruvian forces and the FBI, with Chavez then accusing Peru of taking illegal operations in Venezuelan territory. Chavez was making enemies, and his antagonistic style would precipitate the biggest crisis of his regime. Throughout his tenure as president, Hugo Chavez would make liberal usage of corruption allegations in order to purge his regime of those he suspected to be disloyal. And whenever someone would publicly denounce Chavez or anyone in his inner circle, he made it an attack on his supporters. He is not disrespecting Chavez, don't think I complain for myself. I do it for all of you because this people, our people, deserve respect. Here we have a democracy, and when someone comes to say that Chavez is a tyrant, a dictator, well, he's abusing the people who elected me. Chavez would create an enemy in his early years when he appointed Brigadier General Guaycapuro Lameda as the National Budget Controller, who helped Chavez balance the budget and eliminate waste during his neoliberal phase. When Chavez decided to start increasing public spending in 2000 against the advice of Lameda, Chavez would promote him to the head of the state oil company, tasked with getting its books in order. During this process, Lameda discovered that various ministries of the government had borrowed money from the oil company, leaving a $2 billion budget gap, which resulted in the other ministries turning against Lameda. Chavez ordered the oil company to buy up failing Venezuelan oil companies, as well as being told to donate $1 million to a leftist political party in Bolivia, which Lameda refused, citing laws and regulations forbidding it. In February 2002, Chavez would fire Lameda, who would choose to cut all ties with the regime and re-enter private life. Chavez had also been antagonistic to the political opposition, frequently interrupting the operations of private television companies just to spew propaganda against them. Chavez's intentionally polarizing rhetoric was met with an equally hostile media environment, with all the privately owned TV stations opposed to Chavez and his policies, going so far as to report a mix of facts, lies, and exaggerations about everything the president did. What Chavez said mattered. He was a master of language and communication. He toyed with words, revived old ones, coined new ones, made them sing and sting. Words can provoke reactions and create their own reality. Words spawned hatred and polarization. These tensions came to a head on April 5, 2002, when Chavez fired all the executives of the state oil company on live TV, humiliating them one by one, accusing them of corruption or dereliction of duty. This led to the political opposition calling a strike. The strike was led by the triumvirate of Pedro Carmona, the head of the Business Federation, Carlos Ortega, the head of the largest labor union in Venezuela, and Lameda, representing the fired oil executives. There was supposed to be a march down to the headquarters of the state oil company, where speakers would publicly demand President Chavez to reinstate the fired oil executives. But the crowds, egged on by union leader Carlos Ortega, would begin marching on the Miraflores Palace. As they neared the palace, the marchers were confronted by the National Guard, as well as pro-Chavez street gangs and militias. Shots from snipers would set off fighting between the two sides. TV stations had sent film crews to cover the protests and then proceeded to cover the violence, broadcasting footage of the well-armed National Guard attacking the relatively unarmed protesters. As news of this reached the president, he issued an order to interrupt all TV stations and air an impromptu speech by himself, telling everyone to calm down. The situation isn't serious, the situation is under control. Some stations chose to bend the law by broadcasting both Chavez's speech alongside footage of the fighting outside Miraflores. After 2 hours, Chavez ended his broadcast and began to arm himself while hunkering down in a bunker. He then issued an order to the military to retake control of Caracas, but the generals refused, fearing it would result in another massacre like the Caracazo. Lamita had left the protest after it arrived outside the palace and began traveling to all the TV stations in Caracas, imploring the military to intervene against Chavez. By midnight, the crowds had dispersed, but the streets weren't safe, with many government ministers and officials going into hiding in order to protect themselves against anti-Chavez vigilantes. The generals then went to the palace to demand Chavez's resignation. Hunkered down in his bunker, Chavez reached out to Fidel Castro for advice, who told him, "Do not sacrifice yourself. Do not be a martyr like Allende. You must survive." In the early hours of April 12, 2002, Chavez surrendered himself to the generals, who brought him to the naval base at La Orchila as anti-Chavista mobs surrounded the Cuban embassy and continued hunting down lower-ranked members of the regime on the streets of Caracas. The generals then asked one of the heads of the demonstration, Pedro Carmona, to act as interim president. He was sworn into office on live TV and announced the dissolution of the legislature and the revoking of Chavez's constitution. When word of this reached the U.S., the Bush administration reacted cautiously but optimistic.
Let me share with you the administration's thoughts about what's taking place in Venezuela. It remains a somewhat fluid situation. But yesterday's events in Venezuela resulted in a change in the government and the assumption of a transitional authority until new elections can be held. The details still are unclear. We know that the action encouraged by the Chavez government provoked this crisis. According to the best information available, the Chavez government suppressed peaceful demonstrations. Government supporters, on orders from the Chavez government, fired on unarmed, peaceful protesters, resulting in 10 killed and 100 wounded. The Venezuelan military and the police refused to fire on the peaceful demonstrators and refused to support the government's role in such human rights violations.
Off camera, Pedro Carmona began handing out government jobs to his friends in the business community, but did nothing to retain the support of the unions, the other leg of this coup. In our souls, we knew it was wrong. We were taking a shortcut, playing rough, but you must understand, we hated Chavez so much, we couldn't help it. We couldn't stand it anymore. It's like a scab you're not supposed to scratch. We scratched and scratched until it bled. We won, or thought we had won, but then we made a terrible mistake. We picked that fucking dwarf. And it didn't take long for a counter-coup to brew. Commander Raul Baudel, head of the 42nd Parachute Brigade at Maracay, was deployed to Caracas within 24 hours of initial demonstrations. Raul Baudel grew up in Maracay and would join the military academy in 1972, a year after Chavez himself. Unlike Hugo, he was more of an introvert and a bit of a weeb. Put a pin in that because it becomes relevant later. He was part of Chavez's secret revolutionary cell in the army and was a co-conspirator in the failed 1992 coup. But because his involvement wasn't uncovered until after Chavez came to power, he avoided arrest and was eventually made a general by Chavez. When news of the coup reached him, he mobilized his paratroopers and managed to rally the entire 4th Division of the Army to his cause. By the morning of April 13th, he was publicly denouncing Carmona and demanding the return of President Chavez. But by this point, the residents of the slums that surrounded Miraflores had poured into the streets in support of Chavez. The privately owned media tried to cover up the counter-revolution in the streets, airing movies and cartoons as if nothing was going on. As the palace was stormed by soldiers and slum mobs, the members of Carmona's regime fled. As Baudel's paratroopers liberated Hugo from his imprisonment from La Orchila, he returned him to the palace. Chavez was shockingly lenient after the coup, with only 11 people going to jail, all of whom were police officers whom he accused of orchestrating the violence against unarmed civilians. However, it wouldn't take long for Chavez to begin publicly accusing the CIA of having fomented the coup. This version of the events would become popular in the Kremlin as well as amongst leftists around the world, including a documentary funded by the Irish government called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." The classified documents have shown that the CIA was aware or suspected that some kind of coup was being planned, but not only did the CIA not get involved in the coup, but the State Department, through the U.S. ambassador in Caracas, tried to warn Chavez about it beforehand. But this didn't stop Chavez and his cheerleaders around the world from continuing the conspiracy theory to this day. I can almost guarantee you that someone in the comments right now is saying something about how this being a color revolution or a US-backed coup. And if it's not there now, it will be in about a year. Although there may have been few direct consequences for most individuals involved in the 2002 coup, there would be plenty of consequences for Chavez's political system, becoming ever more centric around his presidency. Chavez would become far more secretive after the coup, making most of his important decisions hidden in a bunker below his office. It was also around this time that the Chavista regime brought Cuban personnel into its ranks, who were constantly feeding the president stories about alleged coup plots that they were thwarting, driving his insecurities even further. The secret police, whose primary job up until the coup was to spy on other security organizations, businessmen, and diplomats, would instead be re-geared towards preserving the Chavez regime. To further secure his regime, he purged the military, replacing many of its officers with Cubans, which wasn't appreciated by the Venezuelan officers that survived. And promotions within the military became dependent upon loyalty to Chavez, which resulted in discipline and readiness suffering, with troops and entire divisions frequently going AWOL. Chavez also became more dependent on leftist civilian militias and gangs, who cooperated in the drug trade out of Colombia, with army officers and law enforcement getting involved, furthering corruption and violent crime. In order to further weaken rivals, he allowed the National Guard to balkanize, with various divisions being financially independent via their involvement in both legitimate businesses as well as the black market. Divisions that controlled individual prisons or roads would jealously guard their territory from other divisions. But the political opposition wasn't quite done. In the fall of 2002, they began orchestrating general strikes, with unions refusing to work and businesses refusing to operate, which included workers at the state oil company. In terms of finances, the strikes had a minimal impact due to most government revenue coming from the oil industry, and Chavez would respond to the oil workers' strike by firing all of them and replacing them with his party loyalists, regardless of their lack of training or experience. This would prove to be a long-term detriment to the oil industry, still not recovering from the loss over 20 years later. The greater impact, however, was on consumers, with factories and plants withholding their products from distribution, thus causing shortages and inflation. The intention of the strike leaders was to cause enough economic disruption that it creates mass protests in which people demand that Chavez either resign or hold new elections. Instead, Chavez would send soldiers to factories with camera crews to broadcast the live appropriation of goods that the government would then redistribute to the public. The raids were very popular, and the general strikes would die out shortly after in early 2003. And these strikes would be followed by some of the best economic years of the Chavista regime. There had been upward pressure on oil prices since 2000, but the real boom didn't begin until after the invasion of Iraq, which coincided with a drastic increase in oil consumption from countries like China and India. And Chavez would use this oil surplus to finance a lavish suite of welfare programs to buy the support of peasants and reward the loyalty of allies. The young Chavista cadres and Chavez himself were convinced that they could deliver, or more precisely purchase, a utopian society after destroying the current one. The old state, its institutions, culture, and rules would be torched in the name of an oil-financed ethno-nationalist redemption. Much of this new welfare state would be administered by quasi-state organs known as missions, with many of them operated by Cuban personnel, with Castro trading Cuban labor and expertise for oil. They sent doctors to build clinics in rural areas as well as teachers to improve literacy. The new system of Cuban-run clinics operated alongside the public clinics, which Chavez allowed to fall into disrepair, wanting a system that was responsive to his demands rather than one staffed by pre-existing bureaucrats. And the new clinics were intentionally kept separate from the public, with their success being measured by how many clinics they set up rather than the reduction of disease or lives saved. The decay of the health industry would result in increased maternal mortality, as well as the return of diphtheria, which had no reported cases between 1997 and 2006, but 2,000 between 2006 and 2008. If you're still watching the video at this point, then you must really enjoy my content, but you might be on the fence about whether or not to support the content, especially on an ongoing monthly basis. Well, luckily for you, we have alternatives. You can give a one-time contribution to Casual Historian via PayPal, or you could buy me a book from my Amazon wishlist. Doing the latter option, not only are you covering the cost of some of my research material, but you'll also be nudging me in the direction of one topic or another, depending on which book you get. Both of those options, as well as a secret third thing, can all be found down in the description below. Thanks for your considerations, And now, let's get back to the history. State oil revenue would also distort the rest of the economy. The availability of welfare programs and government make work jobs would deprive the countryside of agricultural labor, which had the effect of reducing the domestically produced food supply, placing upward pressure on prices. In addition to this, the regime began confiscating privately owned land in order to create collective farms, 90% of which failed, with the few survivors just barely holding on. State oversight swung drastically between none at all and intense micromanaging, which also contributed to food shortages. The government responded to these shortages by importing more food and then selling it at artificially low prices, which neither private nor collective farms could compete with. Chavez would then send soldiers to raid the farms to see if they were hoarding produce in order to damage the regime. Chavez's war on landowners resulted in the state confiscating 5 million acres of farmland, and in the process burned crops and seized livestock, while also allowing gangs to kidnap farmers for ransom, forcing them to hire bodyguards. Oil revenue also disrupted mining and manufacturing. A state-owned conglomerate owned all the factories and mines in the Ciudad region, and despite the corruption that existed before Chavez, managed to earn a profit. Before the oil boom, Ciudad was at the center of Chavez's plans for building up the Venezuelan economy. But after the oil boom, the facilities were allowed to decay. When the electricity grid began failing, and Chavez had the choice between scheduled blackouts in Caracas or turning off the part of the economy not dependent on oil, he chose the latter. It did so in a way that damaged the machinery to a point where they couldn't be turned back on. The repair costs for these machines were paid for with loans from China. Oil revenue even disrupted the oil industry itself. The Venezuelan government would nationalize numerous privately owned oil companies, all the while trying to extract higher royalties, taxes, and fees from foreign oil companies. This resulted in some of these companies suing Chavez in international courts, and many more choosing to not move forward with drilling projects for fear the government would steal all of their work once oil started flowing. The state oil company was forced to run or finance many of the mission welfare programs, as well as funnel money to various political actors across Latin America in order to sway elections toward leftist parties and candidates. The state oil company also neglected to invest in new equipment or allowed older equipment to deteriorate. They also charged artificially low gas prices, which led to increased road congestion and air pollution in urban areas. Chavez's initial pragmatism in fostering private and state enterprise meant Venezuela could have thrived and built a broad-based sustainable economy, but the 2002 coup and strike changed that. Chavez was radicalized by the private sector's repeated betrayals. He came to understand socialism as political socialism. He started talking about the new man and creating a new society. It was a historic opportunity that was wasted. This is all Chavez's fault. He doesn't understand economics. One of the biggest drivers of corruption was the currency exchange program, which was controlled by government-run banks. The only way to legally trade your bolivars for foreign currency was through a government-controlled bank, and this system ended up creating corruption because of two particular parts: the value of the bolivar being artificially inflated and political discretion. The government would give you a fixed number of US dollars in exchange for a number of bolivars, but that wasn't the only way to get dollars. The black market had a more accurate reflection of the exchange rate, which gave far fewer dollars in exchange for bolivars. The system could be readily exploited by trading US dollars for bolivars on the black market, and then trading those bolivars for US dollars at the artificial exchange rate at the bank, resulting in you getting more US dollars than you started with. What made this system more corrupt was the blacklist. Those who had signed the recall petition in 2003 were on the blacklist of people who couldn't receive any government benefits, including the right to exchange bolivars for dollars. This ended up distorting private businesses as well. Companies across Venezuela forgot their knowledge of business and ignored the skill capital of their employees. The private sector that had been born in the 20th century died at the altar of quick, shady profits on the foreign exchange market. Chavez's rhetoric became increasingly antagonistic toward the opposition after the failed coup, with his inner circle reporting apparent mood swings. The opposition would tone down its rhetoric and follow Chavez's strategy after his failed coup in 1992, and focus on electoral change. In 2003, they attempted to trigger a recall election, which would end up backfiring. The recall required a petition with enough signatures, but after this was turned in, the list of names was made public on government websites. Chavez declared all the petition signers to be traitors, with the names becoming blacklisted by government agencies and missions, preventing those people from receiving government aid or employment. The blacklist would create its own black market, as regime members and bureaucrats could be paid off to have someone's information removed from the list. Chavez would go on to win the recall referendum, winning 58% of the vote. The National Assembly would give Chavez the power to rule by decree, allowing him to rewrite history textbooks again, this time recasting his failed 1992 coup as a heroic event, as well as shutting down the privately owned RCTV station, which had continued attacking Chavez after the coup, while others had decided to stay silent. At the height of his popularity, Chavez would go on to win the 2006 presidential election with 63% of the vote. After his re-election, Chavez would campaign on amending the Constitution to eliminate term limits so that he could run again in 2012, with plans to run the country into the 2030s. But when the referendum was held in December 2007, he lost. Chavez accepted the defeat, but he admonished both the opposition and his supporters for not voting in favor of the referendum, and he would come to blame a former regime ally, General Raul Baduel. Baduel had been an ally of Chavez since his 1992 coup, and was instrumental in launching the counter-coup in 2002, after which Chavez had made him defense minister. But over the next 5 years, Baduel would grow to disapprove of Chavez's behavior and policies. Baduel was instructed to incorporate socialist indoctrination into the military, as well as Cuban slogans such as "Fatherland Socialism or Death." And when Chavez spoke of socialism, Baduel hoped that he meant a Scandinavian social democracy rather than Cuban-style socialism, which it became more and more apparent was what Chavez intended. Baduel would voice opposition to Chavez's policies in private, but this would turn Chavez and the rest of his inner circle against Baduel. This culminated in an attempt to destroy Raul's reputation, when embarrassing photos taken by a mistress were leaked to the media, depicting him with a sex doll and a Pikachu plushie. I told you this would become relevant later. Baduel would resign from the government in the summer of 2007, and on the eve of the term limits referendum, he publicly came out against the vote, which Chavez would blame for his electoral failure. In 2009, Baduel was arrested on allegations of corruption during his time in office. Chavez would launch another referendum to abolish term limits in 2009, and this time won the support of local mayors and governors by eliminating term limits for their elected offices as well. The government campaigned by giving away free mattresses and kitchen appliances, winning 55% of the vote. The political opposition had begun to regain ground in the late 2000s as they eschewed non-electoral politics, evidenced by their defeat of the term limits referendum, and winning a wave of local elections in 2008. Chavez would seek to neutralize this growing threat by passing laws that stripped mayors of many of their powers, including control over police, thus allowing Chavez-aligned street gangs to take control of many government buildings in opposition electoral districts. Chavez would also accuse his 2006 presidential opponent, Manuel Rosales, of corruption, leading him to seek political sanctuary in Peru in 2009, creating another diplomatic incident between the two countries. And now I'd like to turn to Chavez's foreign policy post-coup, since this stuff tends to get ignored or sidelined in most of the literature. Chavez's foreign policy relies heavily on oil, either its ability to provide oil to a country or its ability to give money procured from the sale of oil. He would sell oil at below market value to other leftist regimes in Latin America, such as Castro's Cuba, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and Evo Morales in Bolivia, and attempted to create a trading bloc with them in 2004, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, along with Petrocaribe in 2005, seeking to provide cheap oil to its members. Chavez would pick fights with right-wing governments in Latin America, with many fearing being too critical of Chavez and sparking popular backlash. In 2004, both Venezuela and Cuba would cut diplomatic ties with Panama after they refused to extradite the Cuban exile and alleged CIA agent Luis Posada Carriles. In 2005, Chavez picked a fight with Mexican President Vicente Fox, calling him an agent for American imperialism over his support of the Bush administration's effort to create a free trade zone in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico and Venezuela would withdraw their ambassadors, only restoring full diplomatic relations in 2007 after the election of Felipe Calderón. Spanish banks had made a lot of investments in Venezuela in the late 90s and early 2000s, and Chavez had initially wanted to reassure them that their investments were safe. But his relationship with Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar quickly soured due to Aznar recognizing Pedro Carmona's government after the 2002 coup, with Chavez accusing the Spanish ambassador afterwards of supporting the coup. Attempts at improving relations with Spain were made in 2007 with Spain's left-wing Prime Minister José Luis Rodríguez, but nosedived when Chavez publicly accused his predecessor of backing the coup at an Ibero-American summit, leading King Juan Carlos I to say to Chavez, After the incident, Chavez threatened greater scrutiny against Spanish businesses operating in Venezuela. Well known was Chavez's opposition to the United States, refusing aid after the Avila mudslides. He condemned the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and would blame the Bush administration for the 2002 coup. U.S. antipathy for Chavez wasn't exclusive to Republican administrations, with Hillary Clinton describing him as a self-aggrandizing dictator who was more of an aggravation than a real threat, except to his own citizens. Hugo Chavez would call George W. Bush Satan, and at the 2005 UN World Summit, he claimed that Hurricane Katrina was divine punishment for capitalism. President Bush would forge a close relationship with President Alvaro Uribe Vélez, with Bush continuing and amplifying Plan Colombia that had begun under Bill Clinton, which provided training and equipment for the Colombian military to fight the leftist narco-terrorists, FARC. Chavez would allow FARC and other narco-terrorists to traffic cocaine through Venezuelan territory, expelling the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency from Caracas in 2005 for alleged espionage. Chavez would also provide arms to FARC, with the U.S. responding by providing more aid to Colombia. Chavez would use his cooperation with FARC as a bargaining tool in negotiations with Colombia, with the two frequently cutting off and restoring relations. 2008 would see the Andean Crisis, an incident in which Colombian forces raided a FARC camp in Ecuador, where they procured laptops containing evidence that Venezuela was arming FARC. This created an international incident, with Ecuador and Venezuela sending troops to their respective borders with Colombia. The incident came to a head in 2010 when President Uribe publicly accuses Chavez of actively permitting FARC to base in Venezuelan territory based on the info procured in the 2008 raid. After Colombia's new president, Juan Manuel Santos, entered office in August of 2010, he allowed UNASUR to mediate the conflict, with Colombia agreeing to return the laptops to the Ecuadorian government, while Chavez promised to stop harboring FARC. Chavez would try to financially back leftist candidates across Latin America, often using the state oil company and regime-friendly businessmen to deliver payments. He backed Evo Morales during a series of strikes in 2005, for which he would publicly blame the U.S., leading to both Venezuela and Ecuador to cut off diplomatic relations in 2008. In 2006, Chavez financially backed Ollanta Humala against Alan Garcia for the presidency of Peru, which Humala lost due to being associated with a foreign dictator, though he would go on to win the 2011 election. Relations between Peru and Venezuela were suspended in 2009 after President Garcia gave political asylum to Manuel Rosales. In 2007, Chavez would also fund the election efforts of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, the wife of then-sitting president Nestor Kirchner. This scheme was uncovered by the FBI when a Venezuelan businessman with $800,000 in undeclared cash was arrested and who agreed to work with the FBI. In 2009, Venezuela was allegedly purchasing thousands of books at inflated prices from a publishing company owned by the wife of Jose Mujica, who was running for president of Uruguay. And Chavez would use his oil diplomacy to get President Fernando Lugo of Paraguay to revoke plans for a joint military exercise with the U.S. And the weirdest bit of diplomacy was a non-aggression pact he verbally made with President Sebastián Piñera of Chile, the details of which are basically unknown. While Chavez's foreign policy in Latin America were substantive efforts, his work outside the Western Hemisphere would best be described as a bunch of virtue signaling to the worst regimes in the world. Chavez would use increased U.S. aid to Colombia as political justification for Venezuela to sign a $2 billion arms deal with Russia in 2008. Chavez would further tighten relations with the Kremlin by siding with Serbia against Kosovo's declaration of independence, as well as recognizing the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia after the Russian invasion of Georgia. Close ties were also made with China, whom Venezuela would become dependent on for imports as well as loans to support its crumbling institutions. Chavez would cut off relations with Israel after their 2006 invasion of Lebanon, frequently comparing them to Nazi Germany, while also building close ties with Iran, defending their nuclear program, and receiving the Islamic Republic's highest honor. Chavez's heavy spending in the 2000s would catch up with him after the financial crisis and the global recession that followed. This caused a steep decline in the price of oil, which drastically reduced government revenues, forcing the regime to pay for its lavish welfare state by devaluing its currency, something that continues to today. Despite this, Chavez would go on to win the 2012 election, but only winning 54% of the vote, his lowest share since taking power. Late in his presidency, he began having health problems, going to Cuba to have cancerous tumors removed from his pelvic region. After a surgery in December 2012, he suffered a respiratory tract infection and started receiving chemotherapy. Chavez died on March 5, 2013, and would be succeeded by his vice president, Nicolas Maduro. But his story is better left for another time. If you have any questions about the video or ideas for future videos, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. And if you're interested in digging deeper into anything I talked about in this video, my sources, along with footnotes, can all be found in the description. I'd also like to thank the newest patrons and channel members for supporting Casual Historian: Jordan Gorelkin, Jacob, Dubious Zebra, Benjamin Palagonia, David Olawol, and Anand Maudi. The support of these people allows me to keep making videos when sponsors and the algorithm are uncomfortable with the topics I choose to cover. I'd also like to thank a viewer, Lewis Borden, for getting me this book off of my Amazon wishlist. If you'd also like to get me some research material for a future video, the link to that can be found down in the description below. If you're interested in more Latin American history, then I suggest you check out this previous video I made about the Cuban Revolution. And if you want a hint at what the next video is going to be about, I suggest you watch this video I made about the Vietnam after the Vietnam War. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.